All right, so hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. Today is February 3rd, 2022. I'm here with my coworker.
Adolfho Romero.
And we're with the Summer Proctor Oral History Program. Who do we have the pleasure of speaking with today?
I'm Dr. Tom Whitmore at University of South Florida. And this is my wife,
Melanie Riedinger-Whitmore.
Fantastic. And Dr. Whitmore, if you can just tell me about your position, what do you do at the university?
I'm associate professor here, and I'm a limnologist professionally. I study historical ecology of lake systems in Florida. I've been doing this about 42 years this year.
And if you can just tell us what exactly limnology is and what exactly historical ecology is.
Sure enough. Limnology really is a study of inland waters. Sometimes people pertain to rivers, feel it pertains to rivers. In Florida, it's very important. We have 8,000 lakes. We look at the water quality as well as the ecology of the lake systems. There's a great deal. It's a multidisciplinary science. There's chemistry involved, geology, really. And as a historical ecologist, we look at how the lake systems have changed over time. I'm really a paleolimnologist, which means that I look at evidence in sediment cores from the base of the lake because those sediment cores preserve a record over time of both the lake and the watershed. And we study many lines of evidence in the sediments. There will be biological indicators, chemistry. We'll use radiometric dating, stable isotopes, all sorts of lines of evidence that can tell us about how those ecosystems have changed over time and when they changed and what the causes might have been for those changes.
Fantastic. And if you can kind of just give me a little bit about, if you both can give you, if both of you guys can give me some info about your background, right? So where were you born? How'd you guys grow up? What made you interested in limnology and that type of thing?
Well, I'm originally from Connecticut in New England. I had great interest in paleontology and as a young boy, and did a lot of very serious paleontology work supervised by the Smithsonian and so on. I learned micropaleontology, but there was a new science that was evolving at that time. This was the 1970s, and it was paleoecology. And the idea of being able to reconstruct the ecology of past ecosystems using fossil evidence was very intriguing to me. So I went to the University of Florida for graduate school after some geology and biology training. And there I met a prominent limnologist, Edward S. Stevie Jr. He had been a Yale professor for many years and is said to be the father of quantitative paleoecology. And working with Ed had a challenge. He wanted to find how to predict lakes would change in the future given certain types of land use changes. But he had to build models to do this. And those models meant we had to quantify how lakes have changed in the past. There was no means to quantify water quality in the past. So I developed the first statistical models to do that using diatom assemblages. Diatoms are algae that are well preserved in sediment. They're ecologically sensitive. There are hundreds of species. And I studied the ecology of all the species, and I built statistical models to be able to determine past water quality. And it proved useful to the state of Florida because it was at a time where there were no water quality standards established for the state.
And what time era is this?
That really was 1980s, late and 1990s. And there were no clear water quality standards. And many agencies began to approach myself and people I worked with at University of Florida and wanted to know if we could help them determine appropriate restoration goals for the lake systems. And because there are millions of dollars involved in a restoration program, but they didn't know the targets. It turns out Florida is geologically complex because we have some parts of the state that are just nutrient-poor sands on the central ridge. We have other areas with natural phosphate deposits from ancient times where there were nearshore deposits. And consequently, the water quality in the lake system reflects the geological landscape that it's situated. And there was no one water quality standard that you could name for the state of Florida. It really was regionally dependent. So we had to do a great deal of work for the state agencies to try to help to establish appropriate nutrient criteria for the state. And that kind of culminated around 2010 when there was federal lawsuits of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to determine appropriate water quality standards for the state of Florida, because Florida had never complied with the 1972 Clean Water Act to define water quality standards. So Florida DEP came to us at that time and asked if we could help them define the criteria. I had offered to do that several years earlier and went through meetings throughout the state with Nutrient Technical Advisory Committee, but it wasn't until the state was sued they asked us. There was a second dimension to the suit, and that was people maintained there had never been cyanobacteria, which of course is a great concern to people about water quality.
And what is cyanobacteria?
Cyanobacteria are blue-green algae. They are a very primitive form of algae, which Melanie can tell about since she teaches this. And but they do form toxins, and those toxins can adversely affect water quality, human consumption of water quality, and so on. And that was Melanie's expertise. Mm-hmm. So do you want to tell about how you've helped?
Actually, I have a somewhat different, well, similar, but somewhat different background than Tom. I grew up in Kentucky, went to Ohio State University, and did my PhD under someone who had been a postdoc for Tom's major professor when he was up at Yale. And his interest was in lake histories also, but from a South America tropical perspective. After I finished my PhD and became friends with Tom, he shared with me what was going on in Florida and got me interested in looking at cyanobacterial pigments. And part of it was to try to help understand why some of the diatom community changes he was seeing in his cores, to try to see if the cyanobacterial groups were changing at the same time he was seeing changes in his diatoms. And so he introduced me to people to help teach me how to do cyanobacterial pigments. And cyanobacteria are very fascinating in part because, aside from being among the oldest algae, they have so many different adaptations. They are capable of nitrogen fixation. They tend to do extremely well when nitrogen and phosphorus levels are very high. So they're very successful, a successful group that can outcompete other groups, including diatoms. And Tom had noted some changes in his diatom communities that we found were probably strongly due to proliferation of cyanobacteria.
So what is it specifically within their evolutionary history that makes cyanobacteria such, strong kind of, processors of, this nitrogen and phosphorus?
Good question.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I can answer it, though I just taught about cyanobacteria.
There's many good reasons, Mel.
I mean, they're capable of, they are successful in part because they're very good at surviving under a wide range of conditions. Cyanobacteria can be found in soil, it can be found on rocks. They can tolerate desiccation, they can tolerate very high salinity, very low salinity, high temperature, low temperature.
UV light.
UV light, which is a broad range. They also can be endosymbiotic. They can live inside a lot of other organisms, and so they have a lot of symbiotic relationships.
With respect to competitive ability, however, they produce toxins that can inhibit plant growth, and as well as other competing algae in the water column. And they're a very poor food source.
Yes.
There are many things that can graze on them, and consequently, they when they become established, and it's really under nutrient-rich conditions, there is a very substantial qualitative change. They float at the surface, the public sees them, agencies get very concerned because there's a perceivable change and there's a distinct odor associated with them.
And as you said, they're not terribly edible because
Right.
they have kind of a slimy, many of them have a slimy covering.
Right.
And they have gas bubbles that allow, or they're capable of trapping gas, and so that allows them to rise in the water column and cause surface scums.
So when that happens, the agencies are very concerned. It's in a sense, it's almost a tipping point with respect to public perception and water quality. One of the lawsuits that we were asked to help resolve for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and it was Florida DEP, asked us to help. involved with litigation that by organizations that were well-intended, saying that cyanobacteria never existed in the state of Florida before human intervention. And Melanie had been doing work for, 15 years at that point, had many sediment cores, and it's quite true. There were cores in which there would be no cyanobacteria until the 1970s when things clearly went wrong. However, there were other lakes that were naturally productive, and they would have intermittent cyanobacteria or even constant, relatively high. It really depended on the location, whether the lake receives groundwater inputs that are nutrient-rich from phosphatic deposits and so on. It was a complex question. And so basically we demonstrated that, Melanie's work demonstrated the majority of lakes probably that have cyanobacteria are worsened or did not have it in the past, but some lakes indeed did support it, and it was not a correct litigation. So Florida DEP set standards they felt would only allow about a 4% probability for the appearance of cyanobacteria. And so that helped to resolve the question as to what water quality standards would be appropriate.
Okay, sorry. So explain the significance of explain the significance of that lawsuit, right? So
Right.
a lot of these, so you kind of said that the reason why the lawsuit exists, right, is because they kind of had a misinterpretation of the presence of some cyanobacteria in some lakes and others, right? Why is the presence of cyanobacteria significant in those lakes, right? Why is that important to know, and how, and what are the implications, and what have the implications of the lawsuit been?
So I'm sorry, what was the last part?
What have been the implications of that lawsuit? So what has that changed? So what has it changed essentially?
Why the lawsuit matters?
Yeah.
Effectively, agencies are busy, in a sense, if we can say that, and oftentimes will not be prompted to take action until there is a lawsuit. We've been involved in about 3 or 4 of these probably, where we've had to determine outcomes to help resolve this. And I would say that in all cases they were, the lawsuits came about because people were trying to do the right thing in order to protect the environment and protect human health. The answers are sometimes a little complex. And my perception, sometimes agencies do not respond until lawsuits are filed. But I think it's a good thing in a sense, because it's an opportunity for the public to try to advocate for environmental protection that they feel might not be adequate, as provided by agencies. Is that helping to answer the question?
I think if I can add in terms of
Please.
some of these situations, it prompted the state to get involved in research that it might not have
That's
done
right.
otherwise.
That's true.
And so that becomes, I think, an important component.
Right.
Oftentimes, the focus is on doing contemporary water quality or contemporary studies. But for some of the questions that are some of the issues that plague our freshwater systems, you have to look back in time to try to understand how they've changed or whether they have changed.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you can kind of speak a little bit more about the significance of historical ecology as a means to kind of help us understand why things need to be the way they are. So why is historical ecology important?
Sure. A lot of people will say, what does it matter, what the past was like, because we're not going to go back there. And it's, who's to say? I don't know. When we have increasing population in Florida, we have about 300,000 people, at least in past years, moving to Florida each year, considerable development. It's a one-way trajectory where water quality is challenged. And they can say that, well, what good is the knowledge of the past? But the fact is, in some ways, people don't understand how systems have changed. Because the truth is, nobody started measuring water quality in the state of Florida until about 1960. And there was some, scattered water quality measurements. Again, I was at University of Florida and had a large data set of what was done to that point. There were citizens groups that were formed to help the state gather water quality by about 1991. And so consequently, we've got a couple of decades of pretty good water quality. But when we do historical studies, we find out that the big changes, the really substantial changes in water quality occurred in the 1940s to 1960s, because for many decades, lakes were basically used as receptacles for waste. And so we've worked on lakes where cities had 5 wastewater treatment plants dumping into the lake. Citrus processing plants, also like fish canneries, all sorts of industries dumping nutrients into the lakes. So by the time in the 1960s, when things were going wrong, cyanobacteria, again, were very evident. Water, nutrient concentrations were unheard of. Then it began to say, oh, maybe we should measure water quality. And so now when it comes time to restore lakes and to set appropriate restoration standards, they don't know what the past was. And my concern is water quality is not the only issue. It's not simply the nutrient concentration in the water, because when lakes are subject to eutrophication, it is a multivariate change. The communities change. The functions within the lakes change. Many things are altered. It's not simply the concentration of the nutrient. We've had agencies say to us, we're taking the nutrients out of the lake and we just can't understand why it doesn't go back to what it was. And I'll say some basic question like, well, were there wetlands associated with the lake? We don't know. Why? I'll say, well, the reason is if you have wetlands contribute tannic color to the water. That tannic color moderates the algal growth for any given level of nutrients. And consequently, you need to know if wetlands were a part of that natural functioning of the lake system originally. We know that 2/3 of the wetlands, 50% of the state of Florida was a wetland in the early 1800s, 2/3 of which were destroyed by something like the 1970s. That means lake systems had natural wetlands around them. Those wetlands influenced the function of the lake systems. Aquatic plant communities were present in the lake systems, and they're an important part. They're structuring communities to provide habitat for fish, for all sorts of invertebrates. They stop the internal nutrient cycling by moderating wave action. And so all these things have changed. All the processes, the internal processes, all are altered. It's not simply the concentration. Now, if you go to the agencies, and be able to say, what are the agencies regulate for? A lake is impaired if the phosphorus, the nitrogen, or the chlorophyll A values are too high. And so they will bring those standards back by moderating the loading. But there's no restoration of that lake system. There's no question about how did the system function prior to the time of this disturbance. What we try to do as historical ecologists is look more holistically at these systems and understand if there were aquatic plant communities, what type of were they? How did they change? How did this influence the internal nutrient cycling? Because once you have algae and it wipes out the internal, the plant communities, now the wind blows, the wind mixes to the bottom. Our lakes are only 8 feet deep on average. And all those nutrients every day are redistributed into the water column. You can't stop the internal nutrient load. It becomes a large part of the management of that system. You can stop the external inputs, but you can't stop the internal nutrient loading unless you remove the sediments or flocculate with alum and do all these mechanical things. And so the systems are manipulated artificially. And but what I'm trying to do, and what we're trying to do as scientists basically, is to advocate for more holistic awareness of the lake systems as ecosystems that we have to preserve biotic integrity, lake functions, associated wetlands when they were present and influenced lake functions. It's not simply the nutrient concentration in the water column.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, right? But because you mentioned this kind of accumulation of nutrients, right, that kind of settle on the bottom, and how stuff like wind and other kind of factors can, essentially put it in, mess the water column up even without the
That's correct.
introduction, right? It's sometimes something 30 years before, right, can affect subbing, and that's if you're doing everything right. So in some cases, it's a symbol, it's a ticking time bomb, right? And that's on the best case scenario of doing things that are right. I think that's fascinating. Can you explain? So discuss lakes a little bit more, right? So you kind of were mentioning how holistic they are. Why are lakes a unique ecosystem as opposed to, let's say, a river or an estuary or anything else? Or what makes lakes unique?
Well, it is interesting because Florida lakes are different than lakes in many parts of the country. Now, we have 8,000 lakes. And you could say, well, is that a lot or is that a little? Is it average? The answer is you can go to many states in the country and there's 1 or 2 natural lakes. They will say, oh, we have 5,000 lakes. They mean they have 5,000 reservoirs. They dam the rivers up. You know, I go to visit family sometimes in Tennessee. There's 1 natural lake in Tennessee. They will say, you know, okay, but Florida is different because we have 8,000 natural lakes. They stand alone on the landscape because we have a carbonate bedrock beneath. And that carbonate bedrock, slowly over time, has eroded from humic acids and things that percolate through the soils. That's why we have sinkholes. So we have all these shallow depressions on the landscape. They stand alone. They are not connected to each other. And consequently, each one is deep or shallow or acidic or alkaline. We have a great range of lakes. They have a wide range of ecological conditions. Now, the material outputs of the landscape are the inputs to the lake system, right? They're the downhill repository. So everything that comes off the landscape ends up in the lake. That makes them interesting in one sense because they preserve that long record of change over time. Consequently, we can answer questions about how did the landscape change? How did the climate change? I'm one of the chief editors for a journal of paleolimnology, and that journal addresses all these sorts of questions all over the world. People look to see how humans have impacted the landscape, how climate is changing. Those lake records preserve a constant record of both the lake and the watershed. But the outputs of that surrounding landscape are the inputs to the lake. That means if we alter the landscape around the lake, we are affecting the lake. So if we have urban development, one of the things I frequently show in limnology classes, I'll show aerial photographs. And there are many lakes that have wetlands associated with them. And you can see that there's a natural wetland. However, you can look in urban areas and it is urbanized right up to the margin of the lake with sidewalks. And there's stormwater input, right? Because what are you going to do with all the water that comes on the streets? They direct it to the nearest lake system. We've altered the inputs of the lake systems. Now the nutrient inputs, the flushing rates, everything is altered. There's been great human impact because what you do in the landscape affects what happens within the lake systems. And I've been at some lakes here in the county that are very beautiful. They have Vallisneria, Potamogeton illinoensis, Cara, all the plant indicators that are a healthy system in clear water. And it will be signs on the shore saying, do not spray, because they're trying to protect that buffer zone. And there'll be crews out there with commercially spraying. And I'm there with my class, and I'll go over and I'll say, can you tell me please, what are you spraying? And they go, oh, it's just 2,4-D like you use at home. And they're spraying just right on the shore, right to the shore, and people want to cut grass right to the shore. But in the process, there's that transition zone that was natural between the landscape and the lake system, where there were wetland areas, there was habitat for amphibians and reptiles, birds. All of those things become destroyed because people have utilitarian attitudes at lakes. They want to develop right to that shoreline with St. Augustine grass like beneath our feet and cut it basically. And they want that water quality to be clear for fishing and swimming. Because there's 3 things that matter in Florida with respect. It's like drinking water, class 1 lakes, recreation, class 3 lakes, and class 4 lakes are for agriculture. Beyond that, people are not looking at the ecological integrity. I can give you another example, if you don't mind, a couple of minutes story. So we were working for Florida Department of Environmental Protection, Osceola County Public Works. Osceola County was an excellent agency to be working for. And these are headwater lakes since the last few years of the Everglades system. So their restoration is very important to the Everglades restoration. And the lakes in 1892 were joined to each other by canal system. Previously, there was this very slow-moving water movement down through the Everglades, or through marshes and swamps, and it was a very natural system. And but they wanted in the 1890s engineering, it was the dominion of man over nature. And so they wanted to come in and put in canals connected to the river system so they could just move commerce through these lakes. And all the lakes were joined. The water fell 2 meters within the lakes within a month. They cut down all the surrounding cypress swamps, and they put in canals. And today now it's a very complex system where the water the water levels are held very constant, and they have to do computer simulation to move, know when to open the locks to move the water through. And it's been a fiasco because there was municipal treatment, wastewater treatment going into some of the lake systems, the nutrients from agriculture coming down from the north. So at one point, anyway, we were asked, can we determine what the pre-disturbance conditions were? So this is where one case where I said, well, did you have wetlands? We don't know. Why? I said, well, because if there were wetlands, they might have moderated the amount of algae growth, Okay. So can you do that? I said, yeah, we'll look at pollen in the core because we can see pollen, blows from the trees, and we can determine wetlands were present. We look at other indicators in sediment. What we determined when we studied the lakes was a shock to us because we did diatom communities at great detail, stable isotopes, plant macrofossils, pollen analyses, all sorts of lines of evidence. We found at the bottom of those lakes in the 1800s, the lakes would vary between very saline conditions and very freshwater conditions. The reason is the lakes would fluctuate, and I calculated the change in volume to do that, about 3 meters. Those lakes naturally would fluctuate with not seasonal, but interannual changes. 5 dry years, the lakes would go down meters. The lakes would dry out. The organic matter would be subject to wildfires. It would burn it off. When the water levels came back up, you had a healthy system again. Okay. Today, what they do is
Before you begin, so explain why that's healthy, right? So how and why was that the healthy system? So like the prescribed burning came in, right? It burned off all the organic matter, that type of stuff,
That's
right?
correct.
It created, I would imagine, the carbon, right, which helped. One second.
I'm having a little trouble here.
It created a carbon layer, right, which I would imagine kind of helped filter the water a little bit, right? So why? But why exactly did that?
Okay.
Kind of balance things out.
For example, when you have steady water levels, 2 things happen. One is that organic matter accumulates, and that lake fills in, and consequently, you may resuspend more nutrients. Secondly, it promotes exotic plants in recent times, now that humans are introducing it. They do better when we don't have fluctuation. When we have variability in conditions, the native plants can survive as well as the invasives. But if you have a productive system, as we do today, and that organic matter is just building up, it's a problem. So what the agencies have had to do now, because these lakes are hydrologically changed, they have to shut the canals, gates, pump the water out over a period of, extended period of time, bulldoze millions of cubic meters of organic matter, burn it, and then raise the water level back up. And they have to do this every few years, where the lakes did this naturally. It was a natural cleansing function, because when those lakes were allowed to fluctuate, as it was part of their natural cycles, when that water level dropped, it would oxidize the organic matter, there would be some fires. We get open water parts of the lake today, and we'll see charred remains of charcoal and, open water diatoms burned in the sediment, and sponge spicules. We can tell the fires were right out there. So this was a natural cleansing process. Today it takes enormous costs and engineering work to lower the lake levels periodically, bulldoze out that accumulated organic matter to try to clean the lake system. So one of the things we're advocating for, if we're really going to have effective management, if it's going to be cost effective, in a sense what you want to do is restore the natural functions that took place rather than expending an enormous amount of energy because it's managed incorrectly by maintaining steady water levels. So what we advocated for, and I know it's not going to come about quickly, it requires Army Corps of Engineers for example, to decide on this. And they just to disconnect this canal system, allow the lakes to go back to their natural hydrological cycles, and then restore the marshes that were between, that slowed the movement of nutrients that were going down to the Everglades system.
I have a question. So I'm thinking here, like on Lake Apopka, Okeechobee, a lot of people have been doing restoration. Would you say that's an effective way of restoring the lakes, or is there a better way than what they've done before, or have we moved away from that? Or?
Those two systems I've stayed away from on purpose because they're more politicized than they are. It's more about politics than management. Apopka has become a mess, as far as I can tell. And when my students express concern about it, I just go, okay, let's move on. We've got 8,000 other lakes. You know, I have watched people who I've known well, worked with for decades, battle each other constantly about what to do over Lake Apopka without any good resolution. That's one mess that I'm not going to try to clean up. I think the greater value, in a sense, is to look at ways in which we weren't even aware that we changed the lakes. People didn't realize that they changed the hydrological cycles in lakes. They build dams. There's a consequence, because what we learned with this last study, was published in 2020, was that it affected the processes in the lakes, that buildup of organic matter, the fluctuation in the communities that created greater diversity, the salt phases and the fresh phases. The biotic integrity has changed. I studied the species at the top and the bottom of the cores, and it turns out there were 19 species in common from the top of the core and before the lakes were joined by the canals, and 53 species changed. You know, and what it means is that 4 times as many species changed, disappeared. There's been substantial change in the ecological integrity. I think some of Okeechobee can be managed, but you know that's a complex system because the nutrients come down faster through the Kissimmee River, through these lake systems. There is political debate about the responsibility of agriculture and its role. Consequently, people can't, with any certainty, maintain who's responsible for the nutrient inputs. The Everglades has been compartmentalized to the point where there isn't sufficient freshwater flow through it. They've had to create canals that go to both coasts where all the nutrient-rich waters are diverted now to nearshore systems, and we have algal blooms and things going on that never happened before. And it's all because of hydrological manipulation. Nobody discusses it. Nobody talks about how has hydrological manipulation affected the integrity of our lake systems.
So, you know, you've kind of briefly touched on this, right? But how related all these kind of water systems are across Florida? So you kind of mentioned what's going on in the lakes, right, is affecting what's going on in the Everglades and everything else, right? And then maybe, you know, the recent red tide blooms that we're kind of seeing. Kind of discuss how everything is how all these water systems are kind of related, you know, and specifically how, like, the lakes, right, are really, how by getting rid of these kind of wetlands, right, it's like we're essentially getting rid of the links of the chain, right, to this kind of water system that exists within our state.
Yeah. Okay, I'm missing a question.
So, how are all these water systems interrelated?
How are they connected?
Yes.
Okay. To use the word connected, I have to, qualify, because again, they weren't connected. We have connected them. Today we have the Winter Haven chain, 15 lakes joined. We have the Harris chain. All of those lakes stood alone on the landscape. If you introduce invasive plants to one, now they move through these connections. Why do we have these canals? Well, I can take my bass boat out on the first lake and fish, and go to the second lake and fish, and I don't have to take my boat out of the water. So consequently, if you dumped, as they did in the Winter Haven chain, septic wastewater, or municipal wastewater into one system, it moved down the system. So we've created a chains of lakes where there weren't any. So that's one use of the word connection. The other thing is, the truth is we have a great diversity. We talk about the value of diversity in the world. And Florida has a great diversity of freshwater resources. We have naturally acidic lakes, clear, colored lakes, clear lakes, lakes, you can go to the Central Ridge, which was the ancient barrier islands from millions of years ago, where the water is clear. You can see, I've lowered Secchi discs 60 feet in the water column, and you can see the light refracting, and I run out of line, and the water's so clear. You can, up in the Panhandle, and there are other places where if you put the Secchi disc in the water, the buckle, it disappears by the time the buckle hits the water. A lot of lakes have been affected, but we have a great diversity. So if you say, well, what's the connection? The connection is it's all part of that healthy natural resource in Florida, but it's a diverse group of lakes, each of which has to be understood for its own unique qualities. And the important thing is not just how do we clean up the big messes like a Popka. Some might debate you fill it in, I'm a little facetious, but okay. But I would say, what about we've got 500 probably pretty impacted lakes. What about the other 7,500? The question is, what do we do with the knowledge if we look at how we understand lakes have changed historically because of human manipulation? How do we use that information to protect the others? Do we preserve the wetlands? Do we not take out the aquatic plants because fishermen are catching their lines in there and complaining to get it sprayed? What kind of knowledge, it's only by looking at the past and understanding what happened that we can really understand how these processes occur and what we can do then to protect, with going forward. So the connection is, I think, they're not all alike. Our lakes are not all alike, but it's a diverse resource.
So,
What I was just going to add, just a brief comment in terms
Please.
of being able to learn or to use what we've learned from studying the history of some of these lakes. We know what can happen if they don't put in protections, or if they destroy the wetlands, or if they continuously create a cycle where they've got to go in and dredge the system. Yeah. It might be a short-term solution, but it doesn't address the problem.
They disrupted the natural balance and the natural processes. So now you have to expend a lot of energy and time, and you don't get what you want, which is a clean, healthy lake.
Mm-hmm.
So, and kind of circling back to this, right? So, you have these lakes, right, and you have these wetlands, right, connecting these lakes, right. This kind of creates this big train, right, going from essentially across the state all the way to the Everglades and even the Florida Keys, right. It's like, how does that why is that so significant in terms of the contemporary degradation of our water, right?
Okay, why is the loss of wetlands?
Well, yeah, why? So essentially kind of going back to how all these systems are interconnected, right?
Okay, well, as I mentioned before, we know that 50% of the area of Florida was wetlands. As a limnologist, I'm concerned about what I call associated wetlands. There are swamps out in the middle of the forest, but that's a different discipline. I'm concerned about the fact that the surrounding landscape influences the lake system. And when we had swamps and marshes associated with those lakes, that increased the biological diversity. It was a filtering of nutrients, if you will. It had affected the functions. With the loss of those things, now we have urban lakes. We have lakes, again, that are, you can look at the city of Lakeland or Winter Haven on Google Earth, and you will see lakes with streets, intensive urban development right up to those lakes. How are you ever going to manage those lakes again? They're receiving stormwater runoff, and sometimes we would be called in to study a lake, and I'd be looking at saying there's more nutrients coming in this lake than should be coming from the stormwater. What's happening? Oh, well, yeah, it's connected through that canal to another lake where that gets the sewage input, So these artificial connections people do because they want to, have a place to deflect the water from the street systems, from We, at one point, were working on the Hillsborough River, which is a source of drinking water. And in that day, had never seen anything as green in my life. And there are, I mean, I thought I could get out and walk on it. But, and I'm sure that the county is not going to appreciate that comment. But it was the case. And there were houses right up to the edge of the Hillsborough River at that point. Now, the upper Hillsborough River is very beautiful. Sidewalks, and of course, they all have their lawn crews come in to put the fertilizers, and there's too much manipulation. But the loss of the alterations on the landscape, the lakes are not standalone on the landscape. People want to see it like a bathtub. Look, we've also studied lakes for water management districts where there are privately owned lakes. And we will come out to this lake, which isn't very big, and there are very large houses on it. I think, like, why are we called out to work on this lake? And it turns out that people have permits to pump water from the groundwater because they want to maintain their water level at that level to put their boat in their dock. So it's a little private lake, and they're pumping millions of gallons of groundwater. Now, these lakes are acidic. They have cypress trees growing around them, and they're going down hundreds of feet to the carbonate bedrock and pumping up the groundwater. The carbonate bedrock has phosphorus and radium. So up comes nutrients, alkaline water, radioactive material. And basically, it's done because they have trouble with the fact there might be a couple dry years and the lake level will go down and come back up. People want to maintain it because property values. I mean, that's, it's basically drinking water, recreation, property values, right? Sport fishing, recreation. This is what, and so people want to manipulate the system in order to have it to be exactly what they want. So, we have a swimming pool at home, and, we got to keep the water level. And people want to do that with their lakes. But when we get out there and we find we can't radioactively date the sediments, because that's what we use, radioisotope, because it's too radioactive. They've been pumping up hot groundwater from the carbonate bedrock.
So a lot of people kind of associate, eutrophication, right, and all this excess of nutrients, right, as a result of runoff, right, which is it largely is, right, but I mean, it seems like you're also making the point that, like, this stuff is also coming from underneath the ground, right, because we're essentially pumping up things and, like,
in that case it was, but that's usually not the case.
Okay.
Now, some lakes are naturally productive. I mean, there are lakes that we can show where you've got cyanobacteria, you can go back, hundreds of years. It's a straight line.
And when you look at the diatom communities,
it's straight line.
They were eutrophic systems.
I was called one time by one of the agencies. It was a county, and the lake manager for the county came to the side of the lake and said, "I know this lake was pristine years ago." He goes, "Just do the study, give me the number. I just want to know." So we did a study. Did a survey, pulled 3 sediment cores, analyzed them, did all the analyses. A year later, all the lines are straight up and down. I had to tell them, look, there's no evidence. The communities have not changed nothing. The nutrient concentration values, the algal pigments, everything. It's just like, this is a naturally productive lake. And then it goes, oh yeah, I knew it all along,
But it's important to know that, because if you're trying to figure out management strategies, you don't want to spend a lot of energy on that system, because you're not going to clean it.
It's going to be like bailing the ocean with a teacup, because you're trying to take the nutrients out, but it's coming in naturally from the geological setting.
And I think it's important to understand too, right, that eutrophication, right, is kind of seen as this, you look at eutrophic lakes, right, or a pond, right, and it's kind of disgusting looking, all this kind of algae stuff, right. Sometimes that's a natural thing, right, and sometimes it's actually a good thing, right, because it means it's productive, right, means there's stuff in it, but it's just when humans kind of take something that's unnatural and make it eutrophic.
That's correct. And a lot of our eutrophic systems, although they were naturally eutrophic, have been pushed a little more.
Yeah.
So we'll suddenly see that cyanobacteria. We worked on another lake. It was called persimmon because of the color, and it just had a record cyanobacteria growth on the surface. And at the time, the agency said, we don't know when this happened. It was like, and it was about in the 1990s. So we pulled a sediment core, and the lake was pretty clean. All of a sudden, 1970s, cyanobacteria just shot off the, and there was a really high nitrogen, and some of the homes around that had 35,000 micrograms of nitrogen, which can cause birth defects in the water supply. And the question was, where is the nitrogen coming from? Well, up the hill, citrus, citrus amendments are nitrogen and calcium, we see impacts like that. It was the result of subsurface inputs of nitrogen, resulting from this. But again, it's a remarkable thing is the agencies had no record. They just don't know when these things happen.
So do you want to talk about arsenic?
No.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
Well, there is arsenic. We do have contaminants. So I can't exactly disclose everything with that story.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was actually reading one of your
Off the
papers
record.
before. Perhaps that's something we can discuss afterward. 'Cause
Well,
I did read
yeah,
one of
no,
your
I
papers.
can tell you the arsenic story, part of it.
Okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right, the part I can tell you is I at one time had this hunch that there would be arsenic might be an issue because we have 1,400 golf courses in Florida applying, year round, golf all year here, and applying monosodium methyl arsenate to, tons of it, I would point out. Every year I believe it was a pesticide, or I think it was an herbicide. And this was prior to 2008. And
MSMA, right? Is that the herbicide?
Yes.
pardon?
MS.
Yeah, MSMA.
MSMA.
Yeah.
And so I knew of this little lake that had 3 golf courses adjacent to it. We had worked in it. So we went back and pulled the sediment core and basically did an analysis, about a ton of arsenic or something in that lake. And, the golf courses had been there since like 1926. You're putting lead arsenate in the old days, but then in the 1950s it turned to the organic arsenates. And so it was very significant. We had enormous resistance to publishing that paper. It took me working 3 years. At that time I had no salary on my own, working 3 years. And we were 15 hours a day and 7 days a week, and finally got that paper published.
Yeah, actually, I have it pulled up, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you later how I came into the hunch that was an issue.
Well, I think it's an interesting story, and I'm sorry I'm baiting you for that one, but the fact that when we talk about what might be coming from the landscape
That's
from
correct.
the watershed into the lakes, it's not just nutrients. There are a lot of other things.
Oh, yeah.
And you wouldn't have guessed that arsenic was in the system.
No, I worked in there, and you got it in your hands and everything.
Yeah, and it actually changed our perception in terms of the fact that we could be dealing with some other interesting environmental
Right.
contaminants when we were
Right.
working with sediments.
And there were huge arguments. People say, well, arsenic's a naturally occurring, afraid not in this case. There were golf courses and there were wells in the ground. And so we took a well between the golf course across the streets of the lake, and it was 10 times the federal standard for arsenic. And then we got up the hill from it, and it was below detection levels, and we were able to basically target the fact that, but you can imagine that didn't make us popular.
Well, I mean, so phosphate, right? Specifically, phosphate mining is obviously a huge deal in Florida, right? And gypsum, right, which is radioactive, right, is a byproduct
Sure,
of that.
sure, exactly.
It goes into our water supply, and from my understanding, right, a lot of the communities that are near these, right,
Yep.
kind of deal with the consequences of essentially having radioactive water, right?
Right.
So it's like, I think, and we can discuss this later, right? But I think there's a lot more to be said about that story in terms of
Oh, sure.
not only is it phosphorus, nitrogen, and other stuff, right, but kind of maybe some things are a little bit more concerning
Right.
going directly into our water supply.
Well, in fact, when many times they will dredge lakes because, again, the organic matter will accumulate. And they know full well, agencies, that many times those sediments are full of contaminants. And what are you going to do with it? You're going to take it to some county that's got a landfill that needs the money? So basically what they do is they'll dump it up into islands inside the lake because you can't really move it out. It's contaminated,
So kind of discussing cyanobacteria, right, a little bit more, right? It's like you kind of told us what it is, right? But if you can kind of discuss the role of cyanobacteria specifically with in relation to kind of these huge algae blooms that we've kind of been seeing, not only in our lakes, right, but kind of more, recently in our Tampa Bay and everything else.
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure what question
Yeah.
you're asking.
Would you mind discussing the
oh,
can you explain the connection between algae blooms and cyanobacteria?
Yes.
And specifically the more recent kind of examples of the red tide that we've kind of been seeing.
red tide. Okay.
Okay. Well, in terms of, say, the red tide, say, off the eastern and west coast of Florida, that's the algae the cyanobacteria that are basically taking advantage of those conditions are doing so because of the high nutrients that are being introduced. One of the things about cyanobacteria is they can do well at very low nutrients, but they're also very good at outcompeting other algae. And so what you're seeing basically is that they're outcompeting, they're taking advantage of these excess nutrients. And algae can multiply very, very quickly. If you've got a filamentous form, it just gets fragmented, it's reproducing. And so those nutrients essentially give it a competitive advantage because they're so good at turning it into algal cells and faster than the other organisms. And so that's...
So about the red tide that we kind of see in Tampa Bay, right, is kind of the result of this excessive nutrient, right, of these excessive nutrients kind of getting shipped off from Lake Okeechobee, right, into south of Florida. The current takes this all these nutrients, puts it up the west coast, right, and that causes the red tide. Do you think there's any connection between these kind of historic red tides that we're seeing and the loss of kind of these wetlands that are acting as folders that you kind of been mentioning throughout the interview?
Wow. I'm going to answer one question before Melaie, who's really the phycologist. I mentioned the headwater lakes we worked on for. Those waters go through Okeechobee, through the Everglades, and then end up on offshore coral reefs. So the things that we're doing upstream as far as Orlando, it makes its way down the Kissimmee River through the lake system. So your question's pertinent because it's, there's far-reaching effects.
This is not my area. I mean, I don't study red tide. What I can tell you is, what I know is that the dinoflagellates that cause red tide in Florida can be found in very low concentrations at many times of the year, and they're not a problem. A lot of the studies are suggesting excess nutrients allow them to become competitive, very competitive. And like some cyanobacteria, they produce toxins, and so they certainly have a public health and an animal health impact. I don't think there's a whole lot of doubt that the nutrients are leading toward this. And there's a lot of controversy in terms of the release of waters from Okeechobee. A lot of these red tides may historically stay off the coast, but because of the nutrients kind of spreading from the rivers or the canals, this is where you're going to see them take control.
To kind of just clarify a little bit, right? Is red tide is an algae, correct?
Red tide is caused by a dinoflagellate.
Okay.
It's
Similar.
caused by the one that is most common in Florida is Carenia brevis.
And those are different. And those are different than
Species.
And cyanobacteria is different compared to that, correct?
The what?
Cyanobacteria.
Cyanobacteria are a different type of algae.
Okay, cool.
They're very primitive. The cyanobacteria go back billions of years. They don't even have cell, what are we going to call it, cell membranes or nuclear membranes?
They don't have they have a membrane, but they don't have
the nuclei membrane.
They don't have a nuclei.
Okay.
So they're considered prokaryotic.
Yeah.
And when they die, they break open and the toxins come out and everything.
Yeah.
They lyse.
Fascinating. So I'm just trying to think.
Yeah, sure.
Have you done any research on the Great Lakes?
I have not. I have colleagues who work on Great Lakes. In a journal that I publish for, we have many submissions all over the world of large lake systems. Those I did work with an eminent scholar at University of Florida, Dr. Claire Shelsky. He had worked on Great Lakes. I was in his lab for a number of years. I think it was quite a transition for him when he came to Florida. He did not understand the shallow lake systems. Accustomed to working on these extremely deep lakes with ocean-going vessels,
Right.
And the processes and the time scales are different. And I was explaining to him in the old days that when the wind blows, it would take the diatoms off the bottom of the water and they would get into the water column. And he said, no, you're interpreting this wrong historically. It had to be that the lake got shallow. And it was a decade of time when I was trying to say no. And eventually we published a good paper and demonstrated the whole thing. So I think there's different worlds for people who are working on the big lake systems. Okeechobee, of course, is a very big lake system, but it averages like 8 feet deep. So in many respects, it's like so many other lakes.
It's a shallow lake, yeah.
We do have some extraordinarily deep lakes in Florida, though, and that's part of remarkable. There's one in Gainesville I studied, and it was out in a wooded area, a beautiful swamp, a cypress swamp around it, and there were children who would fish in it. And I said to them, how deep is this lake? It was in a mobile home park I lived when I was a graduate student. And they say it's bottomless. I thought, oh, wow, I'm a limnologist, okay, we got to see this. So I got on the boat, depth sounder, 60 feet deep, very impressive. So we had a couple of colleagues come from Ireland and Minnesota, long coring device, took a sediment core out of it. They wanted to go back 10,000 years, got 60 feet of sediment. So it's 60 feet deep, but 60, Then we did radiocarbon dating. It was a sinkhole, like the Devil's Mill Hopper in Gainesville, that fell in 3,200 years ago, but it was naturally productive, receiving a lot of nutrients from the ground, and this thing filled with 60 feet of sediment. Today it's beautiful. But I'll tell you, twice they were trying to infill the cypress swamp around it, the development. I had to call DEP twice because they were trying to infill the swamp and in a 10-year period. And DEP came out and stopped them. People, when they can get away with it, they will fill wetlands. And, so that was something that shocked me. I wrote a paper on that. It turned out that the phenomenon in that lake had never been observed because it had such a deep volume of water that lacked oxygen naturally in the winter because the light didn't reach to the bottom, that when that lake would overturn in the winter, as our Florida deep lakes do, they would lose all its oxygen to the surface. Well, that had never been documented anywhere. So
because you had this anaerobic kind of layer
that's correct.
Of water, right?
That's
just
correct.
Switching with the
That's right. The volume was the volume of anaerobic water because it was 15 meters deep and it had 5 meters of productivity at the top and it was 52 degrees in the bottom, Fahrenheit. So we'd work on the lake on a 95-degree day and we'd tie Gatorade on a bottle, and throw it in and pull it up.
But you said that would occur naturally, right? So, wouldn't that kind of anaerobic layer of water kind of just essentially suffocate everything on the surface?
Sorry?
You said this occurred naturally, right? This transition.
Yeah, it occurred naturally.
So wouldn't this kind of airless kind of body of water just kind of suffocate everything?
Well, it's a good question. People say, what happened to the fish? Well, I don't know. In the winter, we would see like large tadpoles in the swamp. They're dead, and the kids would run to me, Tom, there's... they must have dumped some chemicals in the lake. And I'd go, no, I think it went anoxic. But there was a lot of fish, and there were otters, and there was wildlife and bryozoans, and it was a fascinating system. I eventually had to move away. I wasn't there to protect it anymore. I hope that it's still, well protected. It was beautiful.
What's it like called?
It was, I called it Johnson Pond. It didn't have a name.
Okay, wow.
I had 3 fishermen there. 2 said Johnson Pond, and 1 said Hidden Lake or something, I can't recall.
Yeah, I'll ask because maybe when I go back to Gainesville, I can try to find this area. But
I published it in Limnology. Well, and it's not understood because another thing I want to point out about the uniqueness. What happened in this paper, we sent it off to the Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Science, a prominent journal. And people said, oh, that's no surprise. We get lots of oxygen under the ice in Minnesota every year. And we had to write back, oh, this is Florida. We don't have ice, this is it. All right. And so they didn't understand it. And the reason is Florida lakes are different than much of the rest of the country. We have warm temperate lakes, which means that they're shallow and they mix almost on a daily basis when the wind blows. And our very deep lakes only mix in the wintertime. When they lose all that heat, they accumulate it. Now the temperature is the same and it mixes. That's called warm monomictic. As you start going north and you get in cold areas, the lakes will mix in the fall, and then you get iced over or something in the winter, and they'll mix in the spring. This is a unique lake district. We also have 12,000 miles of rivers in Florida and some 1,700 springs, right? And 27 of the United States has first order springs. First order means there's 100 cubic feet per second of water. 27 of the 81 are located in Florida. Florida's freshwater resources are more unique and abundant than anywhere. They're dramatically affected. You know, if as a child I would go to Silver Springs and I would see the clear water system today is full of algae because the agriculture, nitrogen's moving through, you know, there's many, many issues. But it seems to me that in some ways money trumps all.
So you've done research around the world, right? And you've done projects in China and Mesoamerica and Guatemala, right? It's like, what makes Florida so much more unique as opposed to all these other kind of areas you've been to, or you know, or what are some similarities you've kind of seen?
Well, I can say when I went to China, there was 4,000 years of civilization there, and certainly 1,500 years where the landscape was denuded and they would terrace for rice agriculture all around the lakes. Tremendous impact. At the top meter of sediment would be clay from all the soils being eroded into the lake. So human impact was very pervasive. Our lakes are very much like they might be in Mexico in some respects. You know, of course, because they have carbonate bedrock, and it's a similar formation process. Some of the lakes I worked on there are very similar. I would say Florida is unique in terms of the shallowness of the lakes, the fact that we have a warm climate, so we have plants growing here year-round. We sustain populations in our lakes year-round. These are productive systems. And we have such an abundance of freshwater resources and a great diversity. There are many states that you can go to where they can set the water quality standard for the lake, for the state, and we'll say 10 micrograms of phosphorus. You can't do that in Florida because you've got the pristine sand areas, you've got the phosphatic areas, you've got areas on a coastal plain, all of these different, you know, great diversity here. But it's a shock. I've taught Florida ecosystems as well. We look at all the diversity of ecosystems in Florida. It's a shock when we drive up the road and we will see a scrub community that's beautiful, you know, and it'll be 100 acres for sale, development. There's just so much, there's not that much scrub in Florida. It'll be a coastal scrub, and you know, it's disappeared. Florida has been subject to a lot of development. As a child, you will get this from many older residents. You know, I would visit St. Augustine, and it was a sand dune area, you know, all the way down to Daytona. Today, it's nothing but development. And the same goes on within the state. Those areas that are most vulnerable, such as the Central Ridge, where everybody wants to develop the land, are the ancient communities with all the endemic, 500 endemic species of plants, you know, that are one threatened list or another, and that's where people want to live. And so 1,000 acres a year or something will be mowed down for development.
I mean, you mentioned scrub, right? Florida scrub jay, right?
Right.
Only endemic bird in Florida.
Right.
It's like, I mean, look how much historic range that's come to loss, and I mean.
Sure, and that's one. But that's the. Here's the thing, though. Melanie started this conservation biology graduate program. We had the only thesis-based conservation biology program in the state of Florida, and one of the things that we realized when we tried to teach students is that students will say, I want to work on the manatee, I want to work on this snake, I want to work on this lizard. You don't save one species. You have to save the habitat in which they occur. They are part of a community. And you know, they need so much area for that community, the population to be viable. They need, you know, protection. And that's a little bit lost, even on biologists. They want to save that one species. That's why what we do, I say I'm an ecosystem level ecologist, conservation biologist. because the ecosystem is the lake and perhaps the surrounding watershed, you know, the wetland area. We can't save the scrub jay without saving the scrub. Okay. Okay.
It has to have a place to live, and
Right.
and that's been a challenge in terms of trying to help people understand the importance of the place, the habitat,
That's right.
and that there's it's not just one species, it's a community, and you know, interacting with the
It's true.
ecosystem.
And remarkably, I talk to even our fellow faculty sometimes, and they'll go, wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. You know, it's like, well, it's because we work at the ecosystem level. Not a lot of people do, you know.
Yeah, I have a question on climate change. With the water elevations, since the icebergs start melting, more water, what does that mean for the lakes? Does that mean, like, would it, like, have impacted, or?
The stormwater, for example, more
Yeah.
water inputs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that a lot of times what people will do is they will divert, urban water to the nearest water body. It's if you dump a lot of water in fast, you have to get rid of that water, and sometimes they will pump it down to deep aquifers, or but you're changing the entire what we call residence time of the lake. You have more rapid input. You have to maintain water balance. Nutrients are coming in at a faster rate. It is dramatically changing. And also, wetland areas have not really been valued very much. If there's people say, oh, we protect wetlands. They do to some extent. But if there's a nearby wetland area and they have to divert stormwater from the street systems, it's going into that wetland. And, you know, they'll say, well, we're not disturbing. What that means is you've changed the hydro period of that wetland. You may have a wetland that formerly might have been a dry 150 days a year, and now it doesn't dry at all because it's got stormwater input. So the hydro period of wetlands have been dramatically affected. Anything that's near urban centers tends to be dramatically affected.
So I think that's it for me in terms of questions. I think the best way to kind of end this interview off is just kind of give you the opportunity to say any kind of final thoughts, any kind of message to the world, to any of our listeners. From both of you, I'd like to hear.
I'll say something. Perhaps Melanie might have something to
Yeah.
add, but I want to say that there are many biologists and agencies that want to do the right thing and they know better. But as far as what agencies are basically required to do is regulate most commonly nutrient concentrations. And that is only the tip of the iceberg. It's like if we're only concerned about the air quality, but we're cutting down the forest, you know. The water quality is one dimension, but what I would encourage people to move towards is realizing that there's ecological and biotic integrity because those communities in the lakes are part of that healthy ecosystem and their function. There's also the issue of lake processes. And so when you maintain that water level because you've connected it to the river system, and now you have to drain it and bulldoze it and do those things, you've affected lake processes. The destruction of the plant communities will make more internal nutrient loading because there's more wave action. And then the surrounding wetlands. All of these things are part of the integrity. The only thing that's really regulated and mandated is the nutrient concentrations. You can get it to a certain nutrient concentration and have a lake that's just a mess. I've talked to one agency one time that told me, they said, we have 5 or 6 agencies that are regulating the lakes in our jurisdiction. One of them regulates the water level, one of them regulates the nutrient concentrations, one of them stocks the fish, one of them sprays the plants, and then none of them are talking to each other. Now, I think that's sort of an over-exaggeration because they get together at the meeting, they all tell each other we're spraying this month and the next month we're drawing the water down. But is that really a kind of integration? And I'm over there saying, look, the lake has been changed because you connected it to the river, and if you disconnect it, the flow of nutrients will be more naturalized. We won't have these nutrient pollution issues. The lake will clean itself. And then they'll just turn back to the meeting. Okay, well, next month we're going to implement it. It's not heard. So I would say stop focusing on, quote, water quality and look at ecosystem integrity. That means functions, biology, and yes, the water quality too.
That's actually would have been what I said. So you did a great job of saying what I would have said.
You're quite insightful, I'm sure you did.
No, that was actually that last story was.
Okay.
That's what the key thing that I think I learned.
Fantastic. Well, I think that concludes the interview. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for being such gracious, so gracious not only for your time, but I really appreciate how cordial you were with our correspondences as well.
Very happy to have the opportunity to talk with you, and thank you for taking time.
Of course.
Thank you for letting me move in because I wasn't thinking of that when I came here. So I appreciate that.
You're definitely part of the research. I couldn't do it without a team.
Yeah.
The work that we do, because it is historical, it is multidisciplinary. It takes 6 experts in different fields. So.
Cool. Well, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Thank you,
All
folks,
set.
for coming down.
Thank you for having us.